co-host along with Sharon Watkins, who will be here shortly. She's the owner of Chez Zee. And Sharon and I are friends, and last fall, we came up with, it was actually Sharon's idea to have this series of local authors, because we have all this, kind of go local, and she thought it'd be really fun. Why don't we have an author series of Chez Zee? That she needs some help kind of putting it together, and I volunteered, and then I got to be the moderator, which was very exciting. So this last spring we had Elizabeth Crook, Larry Wright, Chris Tomlinson, and James Magnuson. They're all so fascinating, so I decided to start recording them because the things that they said were so important and so enlightening. I just thought it was fascinating. So tonight we have Dominic Smith with us, and I can tell a lot of folks have read your book. They either heard about it in NPR or New York Times. I read about it in the Statesman, and I just emailed Dominic and said, hey, we're doing this thing. Do you want to do it? He said, yeah. So he is our first author in our fall series. We also have another complete lineup with Sara Bird, H.W. Brands, and Jim Hornfisher. So I think we're all on the list, so you probably already know about that. So I'm going to introduce Dominic and tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll start asking him lots of questions about this fabulous book of his. He grew up in Sydney, and he's written for numerous publications like The Atlantic, Texas Monthly, the New York Times. He has 3 other novels, all historical fiction. He's won numerous awards and been noted in all kinds of book reviews. And he has an MFA from the Mitchell Center. And if you remember when we had Jim here, he told us all about that. And we'll get to that later. So what I'd like to start off with is, I want you to tell us, because not everybody here has read the book, although a lot of people have read this particular book. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. So tell us about the book, kind of the cast of characters. So set the scene for us.
Sure. Thanks again for having me. It's always good to get back up here. I feel like this mic is a little close. I'm going to go there. Everyone can still hear me?
It was better close.
It was better close. Okay. I'll just keep my chin up. All right. So I guess the thumbnail sketch of the novel is that the last painting of Sara de Vos follows a single 17th century Dutch painting through time. And we see the way that this painting changes 3 different lives in 3 different centuries. So we follow the life of a woman named Sara de Vos, who is a painter in the 17th century in Amsterdam. And we see the circumstances under which she creates this kind of haunting landscape, this outdoor scene called At the Edge of a Wood. Then we follow the painting into 1950s New York, where a wealthy Manhattan lawyer inherits the painting, but then has the painting stolen. And then finally there's this other character in the storyline, and the character's name is Ellie Shipley. And she's an Australian woman, she's an art historian. She becomes quite a celebrated art historian, and in some ways she's made her career on the back of this single painting at the edge of a wood. But it's more complicated than that, because when she's really at the height of her career, she's curating an exhibition on Dutch women painters of the Golden Age, her specialty, for a museum in Sydney. And of course what happens is that there are 2 paintings that show up under the same title. And when she was a struggling graduate student in 1950s New York, she was actually paid to make a copy of At the Edge of a Wood. And so years later, this kind of doppelganger painting, this forgery, shows up as well as the original for this exhibition that she's curating. And so this kind of threatens to unravel her professional life, but also her personal life, her emotional life, for reasons that have to do with the wealthy lawyer back in 1950s New York.
Well, You know, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, how in the world you became so interested in 17th century Dutch art. And you gave us a really wonderful education in this book. That's why I love historical fiction. I like learning. And I want you to tell us about your interest in Dutch art.
Yeah, so, well, first thing I'll say is that I'm an imposter in the art world. So I don't have any training in art. All of my opinions are fledgling and amateur. But I will say that I got very interested in art, especially about 15 years ago. I lived in Amsterdam for a year, and it was my first experience of seeing Dutch Golden Age paintings up close. And there are a couple things that really stayed with me. One was just the sheer variety and volume of the Dutch Golden Age. So we think of the Golden Age, in my mind, before I lived in Amsterdam, the Golden Age was essentially Vermeer and Rembrandt. Maybe a Frans Hals, maybe a Van Goyen, but that was it. So to discover that there were about 50,000 painters working in the 17th century in the Netherlands, that they created between 5 and 10 million works of art, and only 1% of that has survived. That was fascinating to me. I had no idea that that's what it looked like. The other piece was, of course, the women painters of the Dutch Golden Age. I didn't know there were any women painters. But in fact, there were about 24 women who were good enough as painters to be admitted to the Guild of St. Luke. And that was the main painters' guild in the 17th century throughout the Netherlands. Each city had its own Guild of St. Luke. So to be admitted as a master of the guild was quite something. So the story that became the germ of this novel was really about Judith Leister and this one particular woman painter. She was very well known during her lifetime. She was written about by art historians, and yet for 200 years after her death, she was completely forgotten. All of her paintings were either attributed to Frans Hals, the more famous member of her guild, or attributed to her husband. She was married to a painter. And she was basically rediscovered by accident. In the 1890s, two London art dealers got into a squabble over the value of a painting called The Carousing Couple, which is a scene of a couple in a tavern, a man and a woman. The man's playing the violin and singing, the woman is raising a glass to the man, and everyone for 100 years had assumed this painting was by Frans Hals. But it didn't have a Frans Hals signature. And so the buyer discovered a funny little monogram on this painting that was a capital J and a capital L, and then this star struck through it. Leister in Dutch means lodestar or leading star. And so this was Judith Leister, and this was how she was rediscovered. So her story in a lot of ways shaped the narrative of this book, the desire to write about what I think of as the lost women painters of the Dutch Golden Age, and the gaps and the silences in a particular layer of art history. We think we know what the Dutch Golden Age looked like, but actually we really only know a small handful of painters.
Well, what took you to Amsterdam?
Yeah, I wish it were more interesting than it is. It was a job. So before I went to grad school, actually at the Michener Center under the illustrious Jim Magnuson, I worked for a .com company. So it was at the end of the first .com bubble that we probably all remember. And so, I had this job where they would send me to places and give me a new job to try out. So my job at that time was I was a project manager for internet startups in Europe. So I would travel around Europe and I would try to work out how do you start an internet service provider in the Netherlands, for example. Really didn't have any idea what I was doing, but I was surrounded by a lot of people who did, and I got lucky enough to live in Amsterdam and spend lots of time in museums. And so, walking around the Rijksmuseum, visiting it over many times, and then in Haarlem, this is where I discovered the story of Judith Leister, because that was her hometown, and that was the Guild of St. Luke that she belonged to was in Haarlem.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about these guilds, because I personally found them very interesting. That you couldn't they dictated, what you sold your paintings for, who could sign it, who could join it. They had an administrator. They had to give alms to the poor. It was complicated. So tell us a little bit about the guilds.
Yeah, the guilds were complicated, and they were paradoxical too, because on the one hand, I think of them as the ultimate buy local program, right? They advocated for artists in a very meaningful way, and they made sure that if you wanted to make your living as a painter in a particular city, that you weren't going to be penalized by a bunch of, cheaply made imports in your particular form coming in from outside the city or outside the country. And people liked that. The problem was there were a lot of responsibilities and duties that you owed back to the guild. And so the guild was very bureaucratic, which the good side of that is they kept meticulous records. That's great for a historical novelist. You can actually find rosters of members of various ages for the guild. But they were also very paternalistic. And so, as you say, how a painting could be made under the official apprenticeship system, what kinds of paintings you could create, and really how that painting is sold, how it's signed, the market value. You couldn't, for example, paint on your, just paint something on your own as a professional painter and then just privately sell it without kind of going through official guild channels. So there was, it was complicated, and there are lots of examples of artists trying to go around the guilds and being fined. Judith Leister and Franz Hals actually had a legal dispute within their guild where Judith Leister accused Franz Hals of stealing her students. And she actually won the case, which, given the status of women in Dutch society in general and in the guilds in particular, that was kind of surprising.
So as Dominic mentioned, the whole book is revolved around this painting at the edge of the wood. And of course, after your description of it, I just fell in love with it, and I found myself, looking it up and wanting to see it, which of course it doesn't exist. And I know some other friends did too. I really wanted to see it, and you paint such a rich with the way you write, such a rich description, not only of your characters, but of this artwork. And I was wondering if you would please read the description of the piece for us.
I'd be happy to. People do email me through my website and asking for exactly where they can find Of course, I point them to this page number. Okay, at the edge of a wood, 1636, oil on canvas, 30 inches by 24 inches, Sara de Vos, Dutch, 1607 to 16XX. A winter scene at twilight. The girl stands in the foreground against a silver birch, a pale hand pressed to its bark, staring out at the skaters on the frozen river. There are half a dozen of them bundled against the cold, flecks of brown and yellow cloth floating above the ice. A brindled dog trots beside a boy as he arcs into a wide turn. One mitten in the air, he's beckoning to the girl, to us. Up along the riverbank, a village is drowsy with smoke and firelight, flush against the bell of the pewter sky. A single cataract of daylight at the horizon, a meadow dazzled beneath a rent in the clouds, and then the revelation of her bare feet in the snow. A raven, quilled in violet and faintly iridescent, caws from a branch beside her. In one hand, she holds a frayed black ribbon twined between slender fingers, and the hem of her dress, visible beneath a long gray shawl, is torn. The girl's face is mostly in profile, her dark hair loose and tangled about her shoulders. Her eyes are fixed on some distant point, but is it dread or the strange halo of winter twilight that pins her in place? She seems unable or unwilling to reach the frozen riverbank. Her footprints lead back through the snow toward the wood, beyond the frame. Somehow, she's walked into this scene from outside the painting, trudged onto the canvas from our world, not hers.
So in the book, you spend a lot of time, I mean, as the reader, you spend a lot of time with this painting. And because Ellie spends a lot of time with it, you know, it's in her head, she's recreated it. And I also really enjoyed the descriptions of her boiling, you know, rabbit flesh and all that. And I know that you worked with a very well-known forger. So can you tell us about that?
Yes.
That you picked his brain, I believe.
Yeah. So Ken Perenni is an interesting fellow. He is, for many years, he was a master forger. He created forgeries of various periods, early American especially, but also Dutch Golden Age, Italian Renaissance. So it was really not a traditional classical period that he couldn't forge. And he made a lot of money, he was very successful. But he always had this kind of sinking feeling that he was going to get caught. And in fact, he was going to get caught. The FBI has an art crimes unit. They take an interest in forgeries. And they've been tracking him for a long time. They were just trying to get a body of evidence strong enough to convict him. But he sensed that the tide was turning. So what he did, as a very cunning fellow, is that he decided to stop forging art, to wait for the statute of limitations to run out on all his crimes, and then naturally write a tell-all memoir. In which he described in elaborate detail exactly how he created these forgeries. So somewhere in the early stages of writing this novel, I read this memoir and I was completely fascinated by it. There's actually kind of a little breadcrumb trail of what I call forgery manifestos. These forgery memoirs that go back, in some cases, into the early 19th century. And forgers they're complicated people. They're often also angry people. And some of that comes out in their writings. So I read this book by Perenni, and I also suspected it had been ghostwritten because it was just so beautifully written. And I wanted to get to the bottom of it. So I emailed him, and I asked if he would be willing to authenticate the forgery techniques in my book. And as I've said before, that email thread only makes sense for a novelist, right? In novelist day-to-day transactions, because here I was asking a master of deceit to authenticate a forgery of a fictional painting by a fictional character. But Perenni was very obliging. He sent me I sent him my 25 steps or whatever it was. Many of them were adapted from his own book and his own methods. He corrected several of them. In one email, he called one of my steps an amateurish move. But I learned a lot from him. And in fact, although my direct contact with him was kind of fleeting, the most important thing in this book that I learned about forgery came from his memoir. And it's this idea I was left with that forgery is as much about storytelling as it is about the technical side of faking a painting. And I can talk about that, but basically it has to do with the way that the forger has to create narrative suggestive clues to suspend disbelief in the buyer or the viewer. And Perenni was a master at that. So a lot of the techniques that I use for Ellie's forgery come directly from him.
So besides corresponding with a master forger, what other kind of, this is a heavily researched book, and how long did it take you to write? And tell us a little bit about your research process and your writing process.
Sure. So this book did take a long time, and actually there was a failed novel that preceded it that was also about painters. And I originally started writing about the Ashcan School of Painters in New York before World War I, and that was a horrible mess. And I stayed with that for a couple years, and I realized that I really wanted to write about painters, but I couldn't get the material right. And in frustration, I got up one morning and I wrote the description of the painting that opens this book, more or less, I would say 80% the way it is now, without really knowing what it was attached to. And it freed something up in my own process, and I abandoned the other novel, and I started to go down this rabbit hole of trying to build a novel that centers around a single object. And obviously, if you think of the movie The Red Violin that does this, where we follow a single object through time. If you think about Don DeLillo's novel Underworld, where we follow a baseball through time and through many lives. It's not a common device, but it is a way of organizing a novel, and I became really interested in that. My approach to research more and more is my undergrad degree is in anthropology, and actually that's become one of the most useful things in my writing toolkit because I approach research as field work. So I assume that I really don't know anything about the art world in this case, and I go out and I find subject matter experts who know everything about this world, and I, like a good con man actually, I convince them to talk to me and to give up their time and their expertise, and that's really, for me, the most important part of the research. You need the archives, you need the primary sources, because you have to know what I think of as the nouns of the period. What do people eat? What do they wear? How did they get around? But to get inside the head of an art restoration expert, to get inside the head of a forger, it's very hard to get that from primary sources. So you have to go talk to people. And so more and more I rely on that. I feel like that is the kind of agent in the research that brings it to life.
That was going to be one of my follow-up questions about where did that image come from? So, at the edge of the wood. So it just came out of your head one day.
I mean, nothing comes out of a void. I mean, I do think, sounds so existential, right? Do we get that on video? But I think that all ideas are connected, right? So I had been looking. I spent a lot of time looking at Avicamp painting. So Avicamp, if you don't know him, was this. Anytime you've seen a winter scene from the Dutch Golden Age, it's almost always an Avicamp, for a couple reasons. He lived during what was commonly called the Little Ice Age. So he lived at this period of time at the end of the 16th and going into the 17th century where there was a run of 2 decades, let's say, where every winter was very cold. All the rivers and all the canals froze over. So he developed as a painter during that time period, and he became obsessed with winter scenes. He was also deaf and mute, which I always think is interesting because he's got this great sense of humor. In Avicamps, you often see all of society out there, aristocratic looking people, but also then there's like a broken down outhouse in the middle of the ice with a panel missing. There's a peasant going about his business in there. But also very beautiful, like the sky, the scenery is really lovely. So, I spent a lot of time looking at that, and there was something about that hushed atmosphere that I was really drawn to. And then really it's about that, almost like discovering the mood of certain paintings that you're attracted to, and then building your characters and connecting them to that mood. So it's a combination of fiction, storytelling, and trying to extract something from visual art.
Okay. Tell us about this cover. I absolutely love this cover. Can you tell us a little bit about the artist who did this? Because I'm taking that's the skater, right? Or one of the...
Well, this is one of the great questions. Everyone has different ideas about who that is. Well, the backstory on the cover is that originally FSG wanted to recreate At the Edge of the Wood, which I got very excited about, and I sent off. They said, they had retained an artist who seemingly had the technical chops to pull this off. They asked me for all of my kind of visual inspiration, so I sent them 50 different images to look at. But all I heard back from them was that it was a horrible failure, and that they wouldn't even let me look at it. And then it was back to the drawing board. And so out of nowhere, they commissioned a different artist to actually paint this. So this is a canvas that's about 4 feet by 4 feet, including, yeah, sure, including, actually not, you know, I don't remember about the lettering, but it's a real canvas, yeah. And if you look at it really closely, you can see the brushwork.
Yeah, exactly.
And I wish I could remember the artist's name. It's someone that they have worked with before, but weirdly,
It's in the back.
weirdly, it's one of those things where you would think that someone who could create that would be like a stable fixture of their book design department, but he's like some guy. He's like, when I asked about it, he's like, oh, he's a guy, he's Russian, he's a freelancer. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, I thought it was kind of
Well, it
amazing.
says Olga, is it a woman or a man who painted it? Olga Red.
I see, I think,
Yaya?
yeah.
Pronounced Russian name.
So I thought it was a man, but maybe there was also a visual designer who put the whole cover together. So I don't know who actually gets credit for the cover, the painter or the person who puts it in design or whatever.
Okay, and I will open it up for questions in a little while, so I know that several of you have specific questions. When I started reading this book over the summer, and you know, we've got Sara, who's painting, and we've got Marty in Manhattan, and we have Ellie, and one of the things that really struck me was how childless they all were, and how just the art with kind of their feeling. It was just a theme that I caught on right away, you know, because Sara loses a child. Marty is a very painful that he and his wife cannot have children, and then Ellie marries but doesn't have children, and it just dovetailed with the barren landscape. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit, that it added so much of the yearning to the book to me, and your description of them, I just felt terrible for them. And I could really feel
Well, it's funny because I often get asked about this, and I feel like I should start out by saying I have 2 daughters that I adore. But the childless theme or motif or whatever we want to call it was not actually something I was super conscious of while I was writing it, which sounds odd because it is so apparent. But in later drafts, I realized that one of the things I was really interested in is the way that art, you know, so art basically for me is about the act of interpretation. It's about standing in front of the art, right? So art may get created, but until there's someone standing there to observe it, to create a narrative with that piece of art, it really doesn't have meaning outside of the person who created it, right? So I got interested in the way that you have this painting like at the edge of a wood. That's a very haunting scene. It's painted under circumstances that are, you know, filled with sorrow, and yet future observers and someone like Marty DeGroot doesn't really know the circumstances surrounding the art, but they inject their own narrative into the art. So what I think he sees there, and let's face it, this is an odd painting to have above your bed. I think we can all agree on that. It's not what I want to look at right before I close my eyes. But he finds some kind of solace in this painting. I think it connects him to his Dutch ancestry, and there's something about the girl that he finds some kind of solace there, and the fact that they've not been able to, he and Rachel have not been able to have children. There's some connection there. I think for Ellie, the decision not to have children was more a matter of just the way her life turned out. And actually, when I talked to art historians, especially there was one woman, Freema Fox Hofrichter, who is kind of the Judith Leister specialist that I worked with. You know, she had married and had children, but she talked about how often women in kind of the academic world may have pursued a certain track and then found themselves in their mid-40s, and it wasn't like they ever decided not to have children, they just didn't have children. They'd chosen a different path. And so I do think the childlessness thing resonates a lot between Sarah DeVos and Marty. It feels less important to me for the character of Ellie.
So let's move on from other things besides the book. So did your fellowship at the Mitchell Center, is that what brought you to Austin? And can you tell us about that? Jim was, I don't know how many of you were here when Jim Magnuson was here. And I mean, most of us were like, wow, we had no idea that that's what happened there, that they bring in students and they give them a stipend, a living wage, so they can write but you tell us your experience here.
I had an amazing experience at the Mitchell Center. So, the backstory on the Mitchell Center is basically James Michener wanting to donate $20 million to a university to set up a writing program that he really wanted to set up as a kind of working apprenticeship for writers, which meant he didn't want the student writers to have to teach. He wanted them to work in more than one genre. Interestingly, he first started out, he went to Princeton with his $20 million, and they actually turned him down. And Texas said, yeah, we'll totally take you. And so, he'd already written the book, Texas. And so he had a lot of say in how this program was set up. And his vision for it Jim has remained very true to Mitchell's vision, which was really to make it a kind of working apprenticeship, which means, there's constantly new writers coming in, there's people who are visiting who might teach for a semester, but as well there are writers coming in who are teaching a 1-week long set of seminars, who are giving readings. An amazing list of people who come in and kind of give you their perspective on your particular writing genre. And so they do it in screenwriting and fiction, and then poetry and playwriting, and you have to do 2 of those, and I did fiction and screenwriting. And it was amazing. I mean, for 3 years, the main thing I had to do each day was write, which for some people it works out, and for some people they're not ready for that amount of unstructured time. And because suddenly it's like, what part of the writer's identity is you're always trying to steal time, right? Suddenly for 3 years someone gives you time, and you're like, I have no excuses left as to why I'm not writing.
That's a fascinating insight. So is that what brought you to Austin?
Yes.
You applied?
I applied. I was living in Amsterdam.
Okay,
Yeah,
so you transitioned from .com startup king in Europe to I'm going to be a writer and move to Austin, Texas.
Well, not exactly. So I've always had, I would say, at least 2 parallel careers. I think one of the things I understood early is that it's very difficult to make a living as a writer. So even when I was at the Michener Center, I was not going to graduate from the Michener Center, and I certainly wasn't going to go work in a coffee shop and write the great American novel at night. So I kept up my talent, skills in other areas, and so I've always made another living. Often, I've taught, but I've also done lots of writing and editing in the corporate world, in the high-tech world. I've managed to carve out flexible arrangements where I can kind of do my own writing first thing, and then do work for other people. So that's kind of more the narrative. And so I came to Austin in 2000 and have been here ever since.
And so when you were at the Michener Center, I guess this book came after that time, so did you have works that you worked on there that then were published, and then that gave you your other novels?
Right, so the first 2, it was kind of a weird circumstance. My thesis novel, so you had to write either a collection of short stories or a novel for your MFA thesis, so in your 3rd year. And I actually wrote what became my second novel first. So I wrote The Beautiful Miscellaneous, which is actually the only contemporary novel, and it's set in the 1980s. You could call that historical. But it's the only kind of novel that's not really true historical fiction. I wrote that first, and then after I graduated, I had the Dobie Paisano Fellowship, which is, if you don't know what that is, it's J. Frank Dobie donated, or actually his friends bought a large tract of land out on Barton Creek, out near the Austin Zoo, and it's been run for at least 50 years now, I believe, as a working writers' ranch to have, so that a couple writers go out there each year, one at a time, and just to work. And you get to live in the Frank Dobie house and work on your writing. So I did that, but actually while I was there, I began a new project. And so by the time my first novel sold, the publisher wanted to see what I was working on next. They actually ended up buying both novels and changing the order. So my second novel actually became my first novel, which was kind of weird.
No, I mean, it's very interesting to hear how writers, I mean, this is now you're our fourth author, just, how complicated it is to get published and everything. And so what are you working on? What's your day like now? Do you still have two jobs, your writer and then...
At least two jobs.
Yeah. No, you're dad, I'm glad to know that.
Yeah, I mean, I get up every morning. I get up early. I'm writing by 5:30. Sounds really brutal when you say it out loud. But I have a little studio in my backyard. I sometimes write there. I sometimes write in the house. And I'm trying to build, it takes me a long time to build a novel, but I'm trying to, a lot of people start with stories and characters when they have a novel idea. I tend to start with a world. Yeah, and so, so a world. Yeah, sorry, it's that weird Australian fledgling accent floating in and out. But so I'm trying to write a novel about early cinema, about like this period of time between the invention of cinema, and there are a couple different inventions in the 1890s, and the period right before the First World War. And one of the little mini worlds that I've discovered in there is this town in New Jersey, Fort Lee, that was the prototype for Hollywood. There were about 7 or 8 studios built in Fort Lee, and in fact, that's where we get the term cliffhanger from, because cliffhanger became a shorthand term for the kinds of suspended endings that would happen on the Palisades of New Jersey right above the Hudson River, and so that kind of ending became known as the cliffhanger. So I get drawn to a world like that, and I just go dig and try to find characters to move through that world.
Oh, that's fascinating. I like that, because you did bring us, that is exactly how this felt. You brought us along in a totally different world. We were totally enmeshed with the characters, the time, I mean, the scenes. I mean, I'm literally freezing sometimes. It was just so descriptive and wonderful. Yeah, tell us a little about that. I've seen photos of your little writing cottage. It's full of books and it just looks wonderful.
Well, so I had this build. We live in a small house. It's a 1935 house in Travis Heights. And when we moved in, I knew I wanted to build a studio. My only regret was that I didn't build it big enough. Because over time, by the time it's 10 by 12, it's got a pair of French doors on it, and one window, and then a built-in bookshelves and a desk. But over time, other things have been added, like somehow now there's an elliptical machine in there. I don't know how that happened. We do use it. It's not like somebody's 1970s basement where there's like exercise equipment just laying and gathering dust. We actually use it a lot. But the studio was not built for that. So I wish that I'd built double the size. But that said, it's great to have a separate space to work in, because writers are temperamental, and I think if you are in the house and there are people nearby, it's harder to concentrate. You feel like you're listening in and kind of looking for excuses to not work on the novel.
like you're and Jim talked about that, that he was very disciplined in sitting down and setting time, and they must teach that too at the Missioner Center.
They don't.
Oh,
No. But I learned by example. I mean, Jim, he's like, that guy has a carrel in the UT library. And when I would do research at the library, I knew that if I walked on the 7th floor by the lobby, like in the elevator lobby, between the hours of like 9 and 9:30, I would see Jim. And he would work there till like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, then he had lunch, and then he'd go do his day job over at the Missioner Center. And so Jim is a great example of building discipline. I think the other thing that I learned at the Missioner Center is that, inspiration is a very fickle way to get work done. We kind of think we have to be inspired to go do creative work. I actually think you just do the work and inspiration comes out of the work. So I look at it as a lot like, running. I don't run, but people who I what they tell me is that, they hate running the first mile. And that's exactly how I feel about writing. There's never a morning where I get up at 5 a.m. and it's still dark and I'm excited to write. It just doesn't work that way. But 45 minutes in with the right cup of coffee, it starts to feel immersive. It starts to feel like you're enjoying yourself. And so that to me is the most important way I know of like producing work, one book after another, because inspiration is so fleeting, and if you wait for it to be strong enough to go do the work, you would never write.
I think that's absolutely fascinating, and thank you for sharing that. I think that's about most of my questions. We talked about what you're working on and your process and your writing place, and I always, for those of us who are readers, and I personally have absolutely no talent, it's like a miracle that things can get written like this, that you can share this with us, and that we can pick this up and be in another world. And I just want to say thank you as a reader for writing such a beautiful book. I loved it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to add one thing to that, which is that, the book, all books are a dialogue between the writer and the reader. So readers complete the picture, they complete the book. So thank you to those of you who've read it.
All right, so we'll open it up for questions. I know several of you have some interesting questions. I got hands up already. I'll pass the microphone.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I was curious about the characters of Ellie and Marty and how they both are good people, but they kind of slide into deceit. They don't set out, they don't seem to set out to be deceitful, but they end up that way, and then they have this coming together at the end, and I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that, how you view each of them.
Yeah, so when it comes to characters in fiction, I subscribe to the Flannery O'Connor idea of the mystery of personality. And what I mean by that is that people are, we all have different elements in our personalities, and we're drawn to different forces in our lives at different times. And so in a lot of ways with Marty and Ellie, I think of there being, there's more than one forgery in the book, obviously. There's the moral forgery in addition to a technical forgery. And there's also several seductions in the book. And one of the seductions in the book is Ellie's seduction of herself into the idea of creating what she really knows fairly early on is a forgery. And so, as a fiction writer, I'm really interested in the ways in which characters deceive themselves, deceive each other. But I guess the question is, can people be redeemed? Can characters be interesting and likable while being flawed? And I think that is, that's a question that the writer doesn't get to answer, but the reader does get to answer. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in those kinds of characters, and Ellie and Marty are good examples of that. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
I thought they were both very sympathetic.
Good.
And you have a question?
I was very curious as to what happened to all the Dutch paintings, old Dutch paintings. You said only a small percentage survived.
So a lot of them, so I think there's a couple things. A lot of them just decay over time. And a lot of them, I mean, there's still, of the thousands, I mean, if you do the math, I think I did it at one point, there's still at least 100,000 paintings from the Dutch Golden Age that are, in existence today. The ones that have vanished, some of them can still be sitting in attics. A lot of them, if they're not preserved, like especially if the artist was not well known, if they're not looked after, the chemicals are going to start to break down the canvases, the stretchers, and all of that. But interestingly, or more interesting to me, is the fact that thousands of Dutch Golden Age paintings go up for auction every year around the world. And many of them are signed, but we just don't know anything about the biography of the person attached to the signature. So you see, if you ever go to an auction where there's lots of Dutch Golden Age paintings, because there are so many, kind of obscured attributions, you often see descriptions that just refer to, the circle of, and they'll name a painter who is known through the workshop system. So I find that really interesting, that it's almost like there's anonymity in plain sight with a lot of these paintings.
Got a question back here.
So I gotta tell you, I didn't think it was really in character what Marty did to Ellie in upstate New York. I mean, why'd you do that, dude? Because it really bummed me. Has anybody else read it? Okay, then I won't say anymore, but I would just say that was unexpected, and I don't know how you thought of it. I mean,
Well, there's papers on the table. We'll all take a quick poll and see what it does. I mean, I think that's so I'll tell you some of the backstory on deciding to go there with Marty. In an early draft of this novel, he didn't do exactly what he does in upstate New York. And I gave it to an early reader, another writer, a woman who I really trust, and she said, there's something here you're holding back on. Like, I feel like you've set up all of this potential menace, and yet you're afraid to go there as a writer. And I thought about that for a long time, and actually it was kind of true. I was afraid that to do that, I don't know, it was going to be emotionally manipulative, or it was out of character. But actually, the longer I sat with it, and the more I thought about trying to get inside Marty's head. Also, for context, this is the thing that Marty does that defines the second half of his life in a very sad and kind of resigned way. He does see it as a mistake. I think he has regret about it till his dying breath. But that is also true of life. Like, people who are otherwise redeemable can sometimes do things that are very hard to forgive, and I think that's the nature of humanity. And so I decided to take Marty there, and hopefully there's enough preparation for the reader to believe that it's credible.
well, I was shocked, I'll tell you that. Can I ask one more question? The only other thing I would say is that I also wondered about the scene, the ice scene towards the end, and I don't want to give away a lot, but then, at the moment I thought, oh God, that's my worst nightmare. And then she seemed like she got, past it. And then I thought, the painting, oh, what was she looking at, the painting, and then this happened to her. You know what I'm saying? And it's kind of shorthand because I don't know. Was there a relationship between what you had happen to her at the end and the painting? Does anybody else know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of like the connection of the ice.
Yeah. And the skaters and the...
Yeah, I mean, so again, I don't think writers work in, you don't consciously go in there and try to create symbols and motifs and themes. Those do, when you become aware of them, you try to maybe go back and accentuate some things. I think ice in this book and the kind of haunting winter scene is a pervasive mood at different points. So there's definitely, as a writer, when I'm writing about, the latter portion of Sara DeVos's, her life, I'm definitely trying to find ways to connect it to the painting that has given her some weird kind of immortality and allowed her to affect these other lives in very complicated ways. So I think the writer's always looking for ways to connect things, but it may not be always super conscious, if that makes sense.
Look at all these questions.
So they'll be brief, and I only picked up my copy of the book today, so I have yet to open it. So I'm responding both to what you've shared so far and to some of these intriguing questions to go back to what your process is. And I wonder if you know or have identified within yourself some, fundamental grounding point that you continue to call yourself back to faithfulness in the process. So that keeps your characters from doing certain things or allows freedom for your characters to behave in a certain way. Is there a centering at that?
Do you mean like a moral compass?
No. But a point, a centering. I really don't mean to give it. I'm really just curious.
Yeah,
about
sure.
it, because if it were me, I'd start on page 1, and
Yeah.
God only knows where I'd end up,
Yeah.
spinning out things that would, in the end, be disconnected.
Yeah, so I think you have to create. Every writer does this differently. There's no method, but basically you have to create a tension between consistency and paradox in your characters, because that's how real people are, right? We all know people in our lives who, up to a certain point in their lives, everything looked very, careful and restrained and measured, and then suddenly, in their 40s, they do something crazy, right? So personality theory in psychology and for writers has no problem with that. That's just fine, right? As long as you prepare the reader for it, so when that crazy meltdown happens, it feels connected to something. So I think it's less about there being a grounding point and more about you as a writer trying to be in tune with what, kind of what makes people tick, and how the inconsistencies, the paradoxes, are usually much more interesting than the stuff that's really consistent, right? And so I think as writers you're drawn to that because that creates drama. And if there's no drama, there's no real story in fiction. So I think that's a lot of it.
Who is this Jim that y'all keep talking about? Are you talking about Mishner? I mean, most of us don't know him on a first-name basis.
No, actually, we were talking about Jim Magnuson. They both share the same first name. And I never met Michener.
Okay.
If I had, I would love to be able to call him Jim.
Yeah. I was impressed, but I wasn't sure. Thank you.
We used to have Jim around the house.
Yeah, Jim Magnuson runs the Michener Center, and he was our guest last spring, and he told all us about the Michener Center and the process of getting writers. And a lot of us had no idea that they sponsored these young writers, and they give them a stipend so they can write. It's fascinating. Oh, and Jim's book was called Famous Writers I Have Known. So we read his book, and then he came to talk to us about it, and we wanted to hear all about the Michener Center, which is where Dominic came in 2000.
Good.
My friend Blair.
I love this book. Cari saw me jumping up and down. I love it so much. And I can see it. I would just quick comments. I can totally see it as a movie. I mean, the whole time I was reading it, it was so visual, and I love that. I could picture everything, and so I'm wondering if you've gotten any bites for...
Yeah, we actually were about to sign a movie option, which is a good starting point. I'm always skeptical of these things because I've had options before, but it's still exciting. And so if you have casting ideas, I'd love to hear. I can see Kate Blanchett in this.
Tilda Swinton.
Sarah?
Yeah.
Oh, little thing. I loved the beginning and the whale, and I'm wondering if that's based on something that really
Actually, it's
happened.
based on two things. There's an engraving of that, pretty much that exact scene that I've created in the book from the maybe late 16th century. But the phenomenon of whales being washed up from the North Sea was well documented, and the Dutch were very superstitious, and so they thought that this was a terrible omen when a whale came ashore. So there was quite a lot of that documented in visual art and in writing.
Okay, I just want y'all to know you're hearing it here first about the movie deals because Elizabeth Crook told us on our very first that her novel had just been optioned too. She was our very first author to come and talk to us. All right, we've got another question, a couple questions here.
Go first.
You were talking about consistency, and I was curious how you approach writing when you're doing two different centuries and a time span in there too that's pretty wide. And just how you approach writing. Do you write one century first and then the other century, or how did you do that?
So I used a whiteboard, so I did what I would generally do. So there's a 1950s storyline, there's a 17th century storyline, and there's a 2000 storyline. And so I started to think about, I'm always looking for rules to give myself. Because if you don't have any rules, it's very hard to structure anything, right? You're just like, well, where do I go now? And so you create this kind of random pattern. So I started to think about, well, what is the right pattern to move through this book? And the pattern changes through time, but for a while, there's a very fixed kind of cadence. You go here, and then here, and then here, and then it repeats. So I would kind of plot that out, and I would write 2 or 3 chapters at once in that century, and then I would kind of put them aside, or I'd write 2 or 3 chapters in another century, and then I'd put them aside. And then I would actually go back and try, almost think about them like collage or something, where I would think, how can this chapter relate to the chapter it comes next to, even though it's, 300 or 400 years later. And I think, when it works well, I think when writers do that well, it should feel like there's an echo across time. But if it's too neat, if it feels too orchestrated, then you don't buy it as a reader, you start to check out. So I tried to really pay attention to that.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
Well, mine's akin to the screenplay option question, but since film was your second field, screenwriting, since you're working on this film project now, how much do you think your writing and thinking has been affected by cinema, film? And how much do you surely aspire to it a bit if you're thinking about Cate Blanchett? So how much influence, how much aspiration?
Yeah. Well, I had an experience. So my second novel that I wrote first at the Mitchell Center, The Beautiful Miscellaneous, was optioned for a screenplay. And I actually wrote a screenplay for it. It never got made. And that was kind of, like, everyone has their stereotypical, like, Hollywood disillusionment story. So that was kind of mine, where, it was really demoralizing. The story that was really the heart of the novel was about a father-son story. It's about growing up as the average son of a genius. That was always the heart of the story. And the producer wanted to turn it into this kind of kooky, teenage talent, weird road trip story that was going to just be the whole kind of shebang. And so it was not a great experience. I do really enjoy writing screenplays on some level because it's so different than writing fiction. And I think it's great for fiction writers because it makes you get much better with structure, and it makes you get much better with dialogue. And so I'm fond of it, but mostly in the abstract.
Jim Magnuson wrote for television for a while too.
Yep,
Among
exactly.
other things he did.
Knots Landing, I believe.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You should have got him to tell.
Yeah, he's got some stories. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
One more question, and then Dominic said he would be happy to sign everybody's books. So we'll just do a line here. And we've got one more last question.
This may be too specific, and if it is, you don't have to answer it. But in the last scene of the book, Ellie is in the attic, and she's unwrapping these paintings. And the one she unwraps sounds at first exactly like Judith Leister's self-portrait, but it's not.
But it's,
So in fact, did she, from her deathbed, forge this painting?
if only I were that cunning. But alas, I'm not. And so it is heavily influenced by Judith Leister's self-portrait.
Oh, yes, exactly.
Yeah, so
I
that
mean,
was.
the description's perfect except for the picture of the picture.
Right, and also, yeah, there's a few other details, but if you haven't looked at that painting, Judith Leister's self-portrait, go online, look at it, it's at the National Gallery. But yeah, I mean, that was one of the paintings that made me want to create Sara DeVos. And I wanted to end with that image because of the way that she looks as if she's going to speak. And that idea of, art living on through the centuries, I felt like was the right note. So, a good question.